I'm trying to turn off these images, but that's okay. So week 12, here we are. So firstly, we acknowledge, of course, the Turrbal and Jagra people, the first peoples of the land where the college is located and where most of Brisbane is located. We honour them and their ancestors for their survival, their continued traditions and spiritual connections to caring of country, land, sea, water, land, sky, water and sea. We pay respects to their elders past and present, and we continue to support their right to self-determination. And we're committed to reconciliation and respectfully recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. At 4 o'clock this afternoon, I was in an event across at Old Bishopsbourne where Alexandra Banks, I think her surname is, was giving a presentation based on her PhD, which is looking at the intersection of art and trauma theory and theology, particularly paying attention to abuse, whether that be racial abuse or gender-based violence. And her PhD was focused around the windows, the east window at, I think it's St. James Church in Morpeth, might be St. Andrews, I can't remember exactly, but anyway, the Anglican Church at Morpeth in the Diocese of Newcastle, and she was taking us through the different panes in that window above the altar and highlighting, for example, that in the Last Supper scene, Judas is represented as a dark-skinned person, whereas all the other disciples are white-skinned and presumably blue-eyed. Okay. And the church was paid for by the local retired military officer, who was also the magistrate, who had refused to find 4 policemen guilty for the murder of a number of Indigenous men who broke out of the local lockup. And she was basically talking about how the windows and the art in churches is kind of preserving and continuing to promote a particular view of history. Yeah. So there's a lot of work remaining to be done, for sure. And then our Shema, and I'll leave the English transliteration underneath for us. But as we say the Shema together, let's pray for the nation of Israel, which is a mixed hybrid community, despite its protestations to the contrary. And we may have different views on the theological significance of the Israeli state. There are certainly many Orthodox Jews who think it's heretical and that only the Messiah can create a Jewish state when he comes. But there are obviously lots of other Jewish people who think it's the best thing since sliced bread. So let's pray that somehow the values of the covenant and the justice message of the prophets might come to be part of the DNA of the state of Israel, as well as the Jewish religion more broadly. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Achud, Va'ahabta et Adonai Eloeka. Sorry, I stopped to look at something and lost my track. B'kol levavka, u'b'kol nashka, u'b'kol moedka. With all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And of course, we had a version of that in the gospel reading last Sunday. And then the Lord's Prayer, as we pray, perhaps pray especially for the Christian community in Palestine and Israel, and that they might live into their calling to be people of peace and reconciliation. Pater hemon ha'en tois uranois, hagias theto to onomasu, el theto e basiliasu, genetheto to thalamasu, hos en urano kai epiges, ton apton hemon ton epiusion, dos hemin semeron, kai aphes hemen ta ophelemata hemon. Os kai humes afekaman tois havalaitais hemon. Kai me isanenkes humas mais pyrosmon ala rusai humas apo to poneru. From evil, or from the evil one. Okay, so for our cultural knowledge tonight, I want us to revisit in a little bit more detail the question of Codex Sinaiticus and the website there. And I think I'm pretty sure I'll put that website up on the ARC site as well. This is the, I love this. This is the homepage for Codex Sinaiticus, which just happens to be the oldest book in the world, but it's also an online thing. In fact, you won't find it in one piece anywhere in the world except online. So it's just one of the complexities. So that's what the beastie looks like. It's an incredible book. It dates from probably the 4th century, sometime after the Council of Nicaea and the embracing of Christianity by the Roman Emperor Constantine. And of course, originally, these leaves, not this particular example, but a codex is simply a scroll which has been chopped up into segments. So instead of being whatever numbers of meters long, they simply cut every 4th column. They cut it into slips, stacked them on top of each other, and glued the left-hand edge. Look, Mum, I just invented the codex instead of the scroll. So this is one of the earliest examples, and it's the oldest complete book to have survived from the Roman Empire down until today. Okay, so it's a pretty impressive document, and it's available to us through Accordance, both as a Greek text, but also as a sort of set of images, so we can actually zoom in and look at the text.
That's cool.
So what do we have? This is taken from memory. This is taken from the Anki Bible Dictionary, and it's just a little summary. I thought I'll just leave it. So it's called Sinaiticus because it's the book, the Bible found at Mount Sinai, at St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Jebel Musa, or which is also known in the Quran as Jebel Atur. And this, of course, is the location, according to tradition, of the Sinai theophany, including the giving of the 10 Commandments. It's now found in 4 different places, thanks to the not very salubrious activity of Constantine Tischendorf, who in successive visits removed various parts of the fragment. A fire in 1975 happily revealed another 4,000 manuscripts which had been stored in a corner and people had forgotten they were there. Bloody hell. And amongst those were more than a dozen pages or leaves from Codex Sinaiticus. So when I was in the library at Mount Sinai Monastery in 1990, and they were showing me the pages they still had left, they would have been the pages they'd recovered from the fire. And they weren't letting me walk away with the...
I remember this story.
Okay. So it's an incredibly significant cultural object in terms of Western civilization and Christian history, as well as being a very significant manuscript for our knowledge of the Greek tradition of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the version of the New Testament is not the one we have. So they have, although most evangelical scholars won't mention it, there are books in the Codex Sinaiticus which didn't make the final cut, but they were in the Bible in the 4th century. So the story of the canon is a bit more complicated than many evangelical scholars want to make out. So Codex Sinaiticus, written in the middle of the 4th century. It's possible, the story is that after the Council of Nicaea, Emperor Constantine ordered 50 copies of the Bible to be made in Greek, and he gave one to the 50 most important bishops in the Christian church at the time. Okay, so it's possible this is one of those. If not, it's as old as one of those. It's the earliest complete copy of the Christian New Testament, but the Christian New Testament at that time included more than the 26 books that we have. Okay. Handwritten text, obviously, it's in Greek. And it's of course, it's in Koine Greek, it's in the Common Greek. And this is actually the earliest example of the Septuagint from, say, 350, although we typically say that the Septuagint was translated or released or whatever 250 BCE. So that's 600 years. So it's been quoted. The Greek version of the Old Testament has been quoted, but this is the earliest copy of the Greek Old Testament and also New Testament. There's a couple of chapters missing from the beginning, so we actually don't have all of the Pentateuch. It's also heavily annotated. So already in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, people are going through and saying that's a mistake. That shouldn't be, we've got so the little scribbled in corrections, which actually makes the document even more interesting. Okay. So it's an incredibly valuable, influential document. If you're looking it up in accordance, or if you're just looking at the textual apparatus for, in this case, it's probably Mark chapter 1 we're looking at, you'll see that the symbol for Codex Sinaiticus is the Aleph. Okay? It's not an S for Sinai, it's the Aleph, is the code for Codex Sinaiticus, whereas Alpha is Alexandrinus, and B is Vaticanus, because B and V are sort of indistinguishable in some ways. And C, I've forgotten now what it is.
Cantabriensis.
Okay.
Cambridge. Cambridge,
yes. Okay. So when you get the Aleph, that's a symbol for Codex Sinaiticus. Okay. It's from the 4th century, so it's earlier than all the others. These days, you'll find most of it in the British Library. How did it get there? They bought it off the Russians during the Second World War when the Soviets were short of cash. The British government paid like £5,000 for it. It's just empire. Empire is everywhere. And at EAPR, so these are symbols telling you, see all of them have these. EAPR mean E is Gospels, Evangelion, Gospels. A is Acts and Epistles. P is Pauline, and R is Revelation. So basically it's the whole of the New Testament. And it doesn't have any bits missing. Whereas Alexandrinus is missing almost all of Matthew and a big chunk of John. In other words, it's got a couple of pages missing from Alexandrinus. Okay, so that's what we're just looking at there. And here's looking at it. So what I've got on the left is what accordance will give you up if you either buy or use the library copy, and you look at the Greek text from Sinaiticus. You can have it with spacing, or you can turn off the spacing, which is what you have on the other side, because that's how it actually looks in the original as this bit. So here are the opening couple of paragraphs of Mark chapter 1 in Codex Sinaiticus.
Oh, God.
Okay. And notice that as the representation in accordance show you, Jesu Christu is not written out in full. They just put the first and last letter of Jesu with a line across the top. And Christu, the K and the U, and a line across the top. Already by the middle of the 4th century, there were standard conventions which the scribes were using, particularly for the sacred name. So going back to our conversation last week about how did the early Christians make use of Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, it wasn't just the Tetragrammaton. It had become a devotional custom not to actually write out in full any of the sacred names. And in Latin, it's called the nomina sacra. Okay, so there was a scribal convention, which, and we can tell anyway, this is a person with very good handwriting. It's a trained scribe. Whereas the person writing little squiggly bits in between, like up in between the first and second line, they're having to just squeeze in some little comments. Okay, they don't have the luxury. And the other thing is already the Gospels in particular are broken up into bites to be read in the Sunday liturgy. So there's already a lectionary embedded in the manuscript of the Greek New Testament, in our earliest copy of the complete Greek New Testament. Okay, so we're getting into the life of the church behind and around the documents. Okay, that's about all we can spend on Sinaiticus for now. But any final questions? Well, I just put a little bit of non-alcoholic wine into my glass. You see my halo glowing. All right, well, no questions. We'll just keep going. Okay, so we're going to jump in and have a look at John chapter 1, 16 to 18. We'll be doing this partly as a parse and translate exercise. I've already, I have also made a little video yesterday working through this material. I'm just going to bring up a couple of things now, and then I'm going to jump across to the accordance and go through it. So you've got the verses, and in fact, it's not verses 16 to 18. I realized looking at it earlier today, so I've changed that from 16 to 17. This is what we've got on the screen is just verses 17 to 18. Okay, and so because out of the fullness of him we all received even grace upon grace, etc. Okay, so this little segment starts at verse 17. The bottom left, that's the typical critical apparatus material. So when you're playing around in accordance, if you turn on, I'll show you in a minute how to do it. If you turn on your critical apparatus, you'll get the little details. And there is one major textual problem with this paragraph, and it's in verse 18. Okay, and so this is showing us down the bottom what the different, so the people, the examples, the textual witnesses that have homogenes theos include P75, the first hand in Sinaiticus. So Aleph with a 1 means the original big letters in the codex, not the little handwritten changes. Okay, and it's also in Clement and various other places. And monogenes huios, a whole lot of manuscripts have it. But one of the principles of textual criticism is you don't count the textual witnesses, you weigh them. Okay, it's not, well, there's 6 of them and 2 of those, 6 win. What if the 6 are lightweights, second-rate witnesses? Okay, so it's the quality of the witness, not the number, not the quantity of the witnesses. Okay, so we'll come back to that. And then this is looking at it, the same sort of material from Philip Comfort's textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, where you can see he repeats the basic information about the textual apparatus, but he presents it in an easier format. And then he starts a fairly extensive discussion about the manuscript evidence, including, it's in the fine print on the bottom side, P66 and P75 are both 2nd century papyrus manuscripts, and they have monogenes theos, and so that has tended to tip the balance. Now, although the NRSV still has only begotten Son, because of the weight of all the other manuscript traditions. So let's actually get out of this for a moment and go into our other side. So I'm going to open up, I'm going to do it this way. Let's see, I'm going to open up Accordance. I might just have to do it this way. There's the Accordance, and I'm also going to open up the Word document while we're there. Okay, So let's just focus on the accordance. So what I've done, I've already opened up those couple of extra ones. Let me just close them so you can see what I'm doing. Just a bit of a simple reminder of how to set up your accordance. So in this case, I've just selected John 1, 16 to 18. There's the NRSV. Obviously, we're not going to have anything in the Hebrew text. So I'm going to shut that one down because we really don't need it. And then we've got the section here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open some parallels. So I'm going to go into apparatus. Okay, so I'm going to go into, that's interesting, it's disappeared. I should have, there it is. Nestle 28, that's the apparatus. And I'm going to add to it the comfort one that we had just a minute ago, which I think is also in there. Here we go, comfort textual commentary. I could also have opened Bruce Metzger's textual commentary. And then I'm going to open one other one, which you probably have never seen. And I'm pretty sure it's not in the green accordance module, but it is on the copy upstairs. So I'm going to go into come on, guys, I had you working before. Maybe it's a commentary. New. Greek studies. Here we go. Linguistic and exegetical key. So these are all have just gone down to the bottom nicely for me. If they hadn't done that, I would have used this little gear stick, and I can move up or move down if I want to move them at different parts of the screen, but they've all gone to the right place. So in the case of the comfort textual commentary, there's quite a bit of detail there. He's got quite a long discussion about this issue about monogenes theos, monogenes huios. Well worth looking at. If you were doing an exegesis on John chapter 1 and you're including this verse, you'd really want to have a look at that discussion. You'd probably want to have a look at the discussion in some commentaries as well. What I like about the linguistic and exegetical keys is it's slightly more kind of theological discussion of what's going on. So it's moving from just purely grammar and syntax, and it's moving more into exegesis, hence linguistic and exegetical key to the Greek New Testament. So, and it's referring to different scholars on the way through, and it's just offering a number of, I think, more theologically developed observations on the text, which you're going to find useful, whether you're preparing for a sermon or preparing for a study group, or indeed preparing an assignment. So I don't remember which module it was that I purchased that had this in it, but I'm just very glad it turned up as one of the resources I'd accidentally acquired along the way. It is actually quite useful. Okay. So we could use, of course, instant details, but instant details can only deal with one word at a time. And if you want to copy and paste the stuff across into a Word document, okay, but it can be a bit tedious. So what I've played with doing is simply to firstly select the passage, okay, and you go into word chart. It'll open in a new zone, which we'll come to in a minute. And while I've still got the text selected, I'm also, let's just have the text itself. I'm also going to go into the parsing tool. And now I'm going to open up the other zone. So I've got the word chart and I've got the parsing tool. And I can use whichever one I want to use. Now, the word chart, in my view, is really good. And I can make it a bit bigger. You can't make it larger and smaller in the normal way, but I can change the size of the font. And then I just move these across, okay? And obviously I'd have to print it off on landscape paper. That's a really good thing to print off and bring with you to the class at St. Paul's Anglican Church in Ipswich. It's a good worksheet, and you can fill in stuff by hand. You can say, okay, from ek to pleiromatas, out to prepositional phrase, subject, if the thing is a nominative singular, subject to the sentence, subject to the verb, etc. Okay, What's wrong, Keith?
You know when you highlighted all of that,
Yep.
what did you press?
Well, I'm not using an Apple. I just went Command A.
Control A for
Yeah, it doesn't do it. No.
Oh, well, there are children of a lesser God.
Though. It's like bing, and then
Children of the Microsoft God, they don't get the same goodies as the children of the true God.
It's the opposite way, of course, because when it comes to Microsoft products, children of the lesser Apple God don't get quite the same
now children.
functionality.
I haven't noticed I'm missing anything, but there you go.
That's because you don't use Windows. I actually moved back to Windows
There you go, dear.
because
This is not a time for confessions, is it? You can get therapy for that. So anyway, so you can copy that. I mean, all I did was select all and I changed the font size. If you're going to print it off, you've got to make sure that these are your page lines, basically, those blue marks there that are just barely visible. So you've got to make sure you've changed your page setup to landscape mode or whatever. That's fine. You don't have any choice about which of these columns you get. Okay, so it's useful. I think this is more useful if you're printing it off or even just wanting to add to it as you go along in a live discussion. It's good to see the birds are still here. Curlews are still here. The parsing chart, you can actually change the font just using the larger and smaller button. But the gear button up the top gives you a couple of options. So, for example, I really don't want to have a transliteration. You may, but I don't want to have hoti ek to pleromatos in English letters. For me, that's a waste of space when you've only got so much space on a page. So if I go up to the, probably hidden, it's partly hidden by the thing, I can turn off the English transliterations and both sets of English transliterations disappear. To me, that's more useful. I may or may not want to keep the lexical form. There is some value, I think, in having the lexical form, and particularly at an early stage. And then you've got basically the parsing, which includes a very clear, in bold type, a clear indication of the part of speech, and a few other little comments in brackets that are not quite a full syntactical analysis, but giving you some heads up. And then you get your gloss. Remember, the gloss is like the cheap and dirty list of all the words that are commonly used in English for this particular Hebrew or Greek term. And they may or may not be appropriate for your particular passage. And then all I've got to do is select all, okay, and I just copy that. So I can just go copy in the normal way. I come across into my Word document and I can just paste it in. I've showed you how to do this and Chris has showed you how to do it as well. It looks like it might be a bit different in a Mac world from a PC world, in that for a Mac, the separation between the columns are tab marks, whereas you were using some other.
No, they're tabs in.
They are tabs as well. Yeah. So it ends up looking something like this, and I've changed the sort of column width because it by default were the same width, but we don't need. You only need the column to be wide enough to take the longest word, which in this case is pleromatos. So you don't need to have a column 3 times as wide. And once you start making the first and second column narrower, then the second and third column no longer need 2 or 3 lines. Then you can get, most cases, you'll get a verse to a page, if that's important. I knocked the gloss back to being italic because I wanted to sort of tone it down a bit. And then I've got my translation section there. And what I did was, again, picking up some ideas from Chris, I went through and looked for the verbs, and I went for the prepositions, because the verbs and the prepositions are going to help me define or identify where the syntactical phrases are. Either it's a verb phrase, which is called a clause, or it's going to be a non-verbal clause, a phrase, or it's going to be a prepositional phrase, whatever. But these are groups of words that go out together, hang out together. And in order to get beyond the stage of it's just a whole mass of individual words, we've got to get some clumping together of the random data. And so what I tried to do here was, in the case of the prepositional phrases, I just used the sort of highlight option to put the preposition and all the other words in that prepositional phrase, which I can tell because of the syntax, the genitive, singular, etc. Same with the verb. I didn't just highlight. I started out just highlighting the verb. No, I need to do the phrase. So the verb, but it also comes with a separate pronoun, which is not needed, but it is there. And so it's telling us something when it's there. And also, so I've got the verb. Then I noted, I highlighted that's aorist, okay, because that's going to have an impact on the translation and so on. Same thing down here, articles, nouns and adjectives. I've tended to color them with green, so they're grouped together. Again, preposition phrases, light blue, verbal clause, verb phrase in red, even where it includes noun and adjective. It's all part of the one clause, which is controlled and defined by the verb, and so on. Okay. So then what I've done is simply, first column is telling us just that's what's in the Bible. Second column, coming from the software automatically, is showing us where we'd find it in the lexicon. We had to look it up in a lexicon. This is what the word will look like. Okay. So you're not going to look up pleromatosh, you're going to look for pleroma, because pleroma is nominative singular, pleromatos is genitive singular, neuter, of course. The parsing again is coming from the software, but that's what I now need to read intelligently, as in I've got to discriminate and discern what is that telling me about each phrase, not about each individual word, but once I've identified how they go together in little packages, how am I going to, I'm going to translate the package, the phrase. I'm not going to translate each individual word. Now, obviously I am looking at each individual word, but the level of meaning is the phrase, not just an individual word. Now, sometimes there's a word that is so significant or so rare that you might end up doing a word study on that particular term. But even then, you're going to be interpreting that term in the particular phrase where it occurs. Okay, so that's where the intellectual effort is being made. Looking at the parsing, it's already provided for us, but we've got to go through and say, so what are we going to make out of this? What does this mean? What was the phrase that Julius Sumner Miller used to say? What was his? Going back to the 1960s. That was I can't think of it either, and you didn't have any warning. Sort of, what is this, or something like that. Anyway, it was a little scientific opening question on TV before you were born. Then I'll note the glosses, but the glosses are more like, yeah, of course that's what it means. And it can mean this or this or this or this or this, depending on the context. Okay, so pneuma, is it wind, is it spirit, is it capital S spirit, is it breath, is it air, all these possibilities. It won't mean all of those things in a particular phrase. Okay, that's the mistake of the Amplified Bible, which you've probably never heard of, but it was very popular in Churches of Christ circles when I was a teenager, because it gave you, like the gloss, it gave you every possible meaning of that Greek term as part of the translation. And some of it was funny. You could have a lot of fun with it, but it really isn't very helpful. Then it comes to the translation, and because I'm a lifelong learner, Chris has taught me some new tricks. So this was my kind of approach then to the task of translating. Words that I may not want to actually end up using in the translation, I put in brackets. I could have put an extra "we" in front of "received," for example. I could have, but I'm not going to translate it twice. But we've got "we" and then we've got "we received." So and I'm going to translate "kai" as even, rather than and then grace upon grace. That's fairly straightforward. And then down the bottom, I've just put my my more considered translation. Okay. Now, because this was aorist, sorry, where's it gone? There was an aorist here with a verb. Elaborment. I had to make sure I didn't say we have received, because that'd be perfect. Or we were receiving, or we used to receive, or we will receive. Has to be aorist. So it's got to be undefined action. Okay. So just we received. And there'll be some others like that we need to deal with. It's also indicative and it's active, so unlike some of the other verbs. So my translation there would be from his abundance, and I've gone for abundance rather than fullness. Okay. Because I think that's the idea, that there's amazing abundance blessings, but this is where you start to remember, every translator is a traitor. You betray the original when you translate, because you can't and you don't represent the original perfectly. So I'm choosing to put in the idea of abundance, which is a little bit of theological interpreting being added to the text. But it could just be from his fullness, but I wanted to bring out the wow factor. Okay. Then so the right-hand column is a kind of literal working translation. And then from down the bottom, I've just done my kind of draft polished translation. From his abundance, we all received even grace upon grace. There's nothing particularly controversial about that. It's not that much different, but I got there in my own journey rather than just looking up the NRSV. Okay. Questions are welcome at any stage. Let's just quickly look at the next one. Same idea. So the verb here, edothe, is from the verb didamai, and that's a kind of verb we haven't learned about, but we don't need to know that stuff because accordance is telling us this is a third person singular, he, she, or it. It's aorist, it's passive, and it's indicative, and it's from the verb that means to give. So it's going to be aorist, which is kind of given. Okay, but we've got to get the passive element in there. So I've had to say was given, even though that makes it sound like imperfect. Now, I don't know if there's another way of nuancing that, but in English, we express passive in a form which is very similar to imperfect. So yeah, I guess so since the law, and I've translated law there as assume that means Torah, as in not just any old set of rules, but the law, the prophets, and the writings, through Moses was given. That's where that verb is coming in. And then I've got, and there's something missing in the Greek, with all apologies to St. John or whoever wrote this. There is no but. There appear to be two parts of a sentence that are in contrast with each other, but there's no conjunction separating them or distinguishing them. So since the law through Moses was given, and then we have the grace, and then kai, which I'm choosing to translate as but. Okay, so that's where I'm getting my but on the other hand. So the grace, but actually that doesn't work. It's got to be grace and truth. So that's not going to work. I'm going to have to go back to and. I was trying to introduce the contrast element, but so we've got grace and truth, and I'm just putting the and the in brackets because I'm not going to use them. They're there in the Greek, but in English, we're not going to say the grace. We're just going to say grace and truth. And we might have a capital G and a capital T. We think we're talking about an abstract thing like love, justice, and the American way. But, or just little g and little t is fine in Australian English, I think. So we've got since the law was given through Moses, and then there's no real connection, grace and truth came to be through Jesus Christ.
You might put a comma after Moses.
Yes, but there are no punctuation, of course, in the original manuscripts, but yeah.
Provide English punctuation.
Yeah, so.
To clarify. So I think that's
so
legitimate.
There's a tension in the text, and if you were a musician about to perform a score, you've got to familiarize yourself with the text. You know how this composer normally works, you know his genre, and you would literally mark up with a pencil where you're going to make it louder or softer or faster or slower. And you're doing this as well when you're doing your translation. And then what I've chosen to do is to say, the law was given through Moses, but, which isn't in the Greek, okay?
The one is ginomai, isn't it?
Grace and truth came to be, because it's ginomai, and because ageneto is the Septuagint version of vayahi in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew text, which is, and it came to be. Yahi is a form of the verb to be, haya, and with the consecutive, what used to be called the verb consecutive in front of it. It's a phrase that occurs over and over and over again through the Hebrew Bible. It comes into the Septuagint as ageneto, and it's a sort of Semitic flourish, almost a little sort of mannerism, which is in Septuagint Greek, but not in real Greek. But it comes into the New Testament because the people writing the New Testament were reading the Septuagint. And so their version of Greek is Semitic Greek via the Septuagint. So you get this fun. So ageneto is actually a Hebraism, probably, coming. So I've translated it as came to be. You'll also notice I didn't translate Christos as Christ.
So during the break, Greg, I'll tell you a funny story about that. But
Okay.
During the break.
Okay. All right.
You said you didn't translate it as Christ.
No.
You have translated it.
I did not. I translated it at the end.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Anointed one. That's my temporary that's my working translation. And then I've got no, because people will think that's Jesus, whose surname is Christ,
Well, that's
which is not what it
fast.
meant in the first century. So when Paul says grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, he's saying, and Jesus, our anointed ruler. Hasn't yet been turned into a lovely church title. And he always sits in the third row on the right-hand side where the sun comes in on a winter morning kind of thing. So I'm deliberately translating it in a way which will jar, in the hope that the listener might go, aha, of course. Yeah, I mean, you mean Christ, but Christ means anointed one. Christ is just not like his Joseph's family name, and he didn't get it from his father. And then the last one, I haven't bothered to hide the text at all because I knew we'd be running behind by now. Same sort of principle. You will have already had to decide which way you're going to go with the textual questions of monogenes theos, monogenes huios. Okay, and that's what was in the textual apparatus and in the textual commentary from Comfort, and also in the linguistic and exegetical guide to New Testament Greek. You will have had to make those decisions because that will inform, that's going to change the Greek words in the first column. Okay. But notice the accordance, the Nestle Aland 28th edition has already switched across to monogenes theos as the default reading of John 1:18. Okay, because the textual evidence says it's a done deal. Now, if we find another manuscript next week, which is even earlier than P75 and P66, then we reopen the conversation. Okay, so now this is just one verse where there is a significant textual issue. And it's not so much that we've got a problem with the word, it's just that it doesn't sit right on our ears to be saying the only begotten God. For years, we've heard only begotten Son, because from the 3rd or 4th century onwards, that's what most of the manuscript changed it to. And so that's what we've had in the West. Okay, so we're used to only begotten Son. I mean, that's a phrase we know. Only begotten God. Sorry, what? Where did that come from? And what does it mean in John chapter 1 in the first quarter of the 2nd century? What on earth does such a phrase mean? Was John just having a mental moment and he said the wrong word? What's going on here? Well, they're all things you've got to think about quite apart from the translation. So the other thing I've done with translation-wise at the bottom is I've got no one has ever seen good G asterisk D, the only begotten God who's in the Father's heart, and I've used heart despite my misgivings, has made good known. So what I'm trying to do there is to use the way that a Jewish person today might refer to the divine by putting G asterisk D. Just like they won't say Yahweh, they won't even say God. Okay, they'll write G apostrophe D. And it's a way of, I'm trying to play here is that in the first part of the sentence and the last part of the sentence, the one who's being made known is the unknowable one, the God beyond all names. So G asterisk D is a way of trying to flag that for the reader. Bit hard to read in church, but okay, we're not doing this for reading in church. Whereas the only begotten God is talking about the God who comes alongside us in Jesus. And that's not a totally transcendent, unknowable God. That is the God who takes flesh and dwells among us, as verse 14 and various other verses in John chapter 1 are saying. So I would say we have to translate the passage not only to make sense of the words, but to make sense of John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. That's the interpret. You can't have a meaning that doesn't make sense in John chapter 1. It's got to fit with the theological and linguistic geography, topography of John chapter 1. So, and by the time you've done all that, you really have been down wrestling like Jacob and the angel, wrestling with the text and beginning to get some really interesting insights into this amazing introduction to John's Gospel. I mean, this is the climax of the introduction to the John's Gospel. This is the end of the prologue. This is a bit of text which is rhetorically loaded with dynamite, for which the Greek word is dunamis, okay, power. Okay, we could spend another hour or so discussing this back and forth, but just, are there any questions about how I'm doing that, where I'm getting the stuff from accordance, how I'm really trying to make sense of the parsing information? And so, for example, the very last verb there, exegeseto, it's aorist middle, but it's what we used to call a deponent verb, and it means to explain or to arrange or to interpret or to exposit or to take some secret that's been hidden forever and ever and made it known. That's a pretty long explanation for one little Greek word. So how are you going to put that into a phrase that's going to fly in English? So in my rough translation, I put revealed / exposed. That still doesn't quite work for me. So I then said, has made God known, which is a more traditional translation. Okay. Okay. And I still ended up with heart, even though it's not actually heart. It's actually saying the one who's resting his head on God's chest, on the Father's chest. It's an intimate relationship, as in the way they ate. We'd all be lying sideways, resting on one elbow. So your head would be here and Keith's head would be on your chest and so on. That's the Last Supper. Okay, so it's the intimacy of the reclining around the triclinium, the eating arrangement in a family home, and a nice, not when the kids are running amok, but when you've got visitors over, that kind of family home. So how do we express that in English without having to write a whole paragraph? Well, an idiom is to say close to God's heart, because that is close to your heart. We know that idiom, but it's actually not saying he's in the heart of God. That's not what it's saying. So how do you stick to the actual meaning of the Greek or the Hebrew? And when you go for another idiom, which captures the guts of it, but doesn't necessarily stick to the literal words. Okay? Like the word baptize. The word baptizo did not mean baptize in the first century. It meant to soak in a large tub of water until you totally change color. Okay, if you wanted to, and particularly purple cloth, you take some cloth, you'd soak it in a vat of purple dye, and that was baptizo. I'm dyeing it, I'm changing it. So baptism, meaning getting dunked under the water, is a metaphor. And when it came to the King James Bible, they didn't know what to do, so they just went baptise, because they couldn't think of any other. There was no English word for that. So it became a Christian word. But originally it just means to take something and soak it, immerse it in an overwhelming and transformative experience. And it has a metaphorical meaning, going through the challenges of life, but its original meaning is to soak a piece of cloth in a vat until it changes color. And we lose all that if we just say, oh, we're baptizing 3 children today who we'll never see again.
Positive.
Anyway, all right. Coming up to 7 o'clock. We're probably not doing too bad. Are we okay for me to shut the Word document down? Made a couple of changes.
Shutting it down.
All right. So let's come back into this. Okay. All right. So before we jump into the last couple of instances of verbs, I just want to spend a little bit of time on phrases, clauses, and sentences, which is in effect what I was doing a moment ago with the parsing and translating exercise. And I think if we're teaching this next year, I'd probably bring the next few minutes, I'd probably bring it forward by 5 or 6 weeks. Okay. Or if Chris has his way, we'll do verbs at the beginning, in which case we do it very early on anyway, probably about 5 or 6 weeks into the course. But what I'm thinking is, I'm not imputing any lack of insight to Chris or Zoe, but let's just say for my part, it is so easy to forget the things that we just know and we think it's obvious. We don't even have to tell you that. Like there's a phrase here, like it's obvious, right? Prepositional phrase. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that. Well, actually, maybe you do. And so, because until we start working with phrases and clauses, we're just playing with random words. It's like Scrabble. We're not actually having meaningful acts of written oral communication. So I think in future I would do this not in the last week, but around about week 6 or something like that, just in time to get it into the week 6 exam. No.
Good.
Anyway, and then we'll go to infinites and so on. So in English, we know the gig. We're going to do English, Greek, Hebrew, and then Greek. So words can but rarely occur in isolation. Even OMG is technically 3 words.
Okay. What, LOL?
Oh, wow. Okay, that can be, exclamations can be 1 word things. But so some of the particles exist as phrases, just as 1 soundbite, but they're exclamatory particles. Generally speaking, words occur in meaningful groups. Okay, so it might be a noun, it might have an article. In English, it might be an indefinite or a definite article. It may have adjectives and other things that go with that noun. So little boy blue, okay, we don't just talk about boy, we talk about this little boy blue, okay? There's a whole identity there. You know, when you're talking nonstop in a class, you never get to drink your wine. Isn't that just the worst situation? I can tell you're feeling.
Doing quite well, actually.
You're feeling. I can see the thup.
Yeah.
Okay. So usually they hang out in gangs. Okay. A phrase is a word or a word group which doesn't have a finite verb. Bear that in mind, like in a few minutes when we talk about infinite. Okay. But a finite verb is a regular sort of verb that has tense and voice and mood and so on, or indicative and so on. So phrase. If there's no really significant verb there in control, there's no adult in the room, as it were, it's just a phrase. So little boy blue is a phrase. Okay, go blow up your horn. Now we're starting to get somewhere. Now we know what little boy blue has to do. Little boy blue is here. What?
Are you being served, little boy blue?
It's a poem. It's a classic English child.
Probably where I know it from when they all dress
The
up.
cows in the meadow. Something in the corn. Anyway, okay. Clause is where you get a subject and a verb in the phrase, even if they're not there, but logically they're implied. Okay. So
Even if you can't see them.
Is that when I was translating Mark and there was a verb missing, so I had to put the verb in to make it work?
Yeah.
Click.
yes, click. Week 12. Okay. And clauses can be independent clauses. And when they occur in a larger sentence, they're called the main clause. But this kind of clause could just be a sentence by itself. Or if it's got subordinate clauses attached to it, that it changes its ID to main clause, but it's still an independent clause. And we can have dependent clauses, and they're typically joined to the main clause by a relative pronoun or a subordinating conjunction. We'll see some of those. Oh, here they come now. Okay, so the relative pronouns, who, which, that, etc. And that means that the dependent clause has an adjectival function with respect to the main verb. It's telling you something about when and how big it was or whatever. It's an adjectival.
Saw that in Mark 4 as well, the relative clause.
And if it's a subordinating conjunction, it's going to be things like after, although, because, if, except. And then again, it's relating back to the main clause, but it's adding information to the verb the whole phrase is like a turbocharged adverb. Okay. And you can read all about that in Hebrew for the rest of us, pages 74, 75, and 76. But I know you won't. I'm just putting my footnotes in because, I'm that kind of.
How do you know we won't? We might
romantic side
all along.
Okay, of course you have. And then you've got a sentence which is either one clause, in which case it's a simple sentence, like simple Simon Mendo, or if it's got more than one clause, it's a compound sentence. Now this is English, okay? We all know this, okay?
Is there any more whinge?
Find that a lot of people don't know this stuff.
Oh, indeed, especially when you're marking their essays.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I'm terrified about.
Or if they're getting up and giving a talk or whatever. Yeah, leading a lit. Yeah. So these are aspects of so English, like all languages, has different registers, and colloquial conversational English still does have this stuff, but we don't pay a lot of attention to it. The way we write text messages and so on has a distant relationship to grammar. But if we're giving a talk, if we're giving a sermon, I would like to think, at least in a proper Anglican church, that there's some coherent grammar and good use of English, because God only likes proper English,
Maybe don't come to my service then.
I'm partly joking, but if you find yourself in court, then you may have to make sure you or the person you pay to represent you speaks in a register, a pitch and a genre which is appropriate to that context. Your Honour, on behalf of my client, we wish to ask, and so on. None of this. What the hell do you think you're doing? No, you don't talk to the judge like that. nor do you talk to the Archbishop like that. Okay, it's the difference between writing a letter to the Archbishop and writing a letter to Chris to say thank you for all the wonderful input you've had this year. Okay. So as Chris has reminded us several times, we start with the verbs because verbs are really the key players in what's going on, as distinct from who's doing it, to whom, and how much of it. What's going on is really about verbs. So Hebrew, usually, or as a general rule, not 100% of the time, verbs usually come first in a Hebrew phrase, and that kind of helps. Okay, now they may have a vav attached to the front, and sometimes there'll be a preposition like bereshi, bara, or participle attached to the front. But as a general rule, it's going to be stood, the man. No, stood is not a verb that has any transitive action, but ate the man the bread. That's going to be the default order. Ate the man the tall, the bread the stale. Okay, it's going to be noun plus adjective, noun plus adjective. It's going to be verb, subject, object with whatever modifiers need to be put in there. Okay, theoretically. So when you see a verb, and particularly if it's got a vav in front of it, there's a good chance you're looking at the start of a clause or phrase. Okay, or if it's a verb, then it's a clause. Okay, so there are two kinds of verb clauses, of course. I'm going to talk a bit more about haya shortly. But if the verb is anything other than haya, which is the verb to be, no point asking you, the answer's right there on the screen. Okay, haya we've looked at last Thursday, last Monday. So if it's any other verb, it's a verb clause. Okay. If it doesn't have a regular verb in there, it's what in Arabic we call a verbaless sentence, because in Arabic, as in Hebrew, often the verb to be is left out, but it is still understood as being present. Now, that's particularly true even in Greek as well. If you've got the man good, no, that's a hard concept for some people, but the man good, then it's the man is good. Whereas the good man it's an adjective. It's adding an attribute to the man. Whereas if it's without the article and it's coming after the noun, then it's going to be that sense of the man is. You've got to understand the verb to be, even if it's not there, if it's just implied. So, for example, Genesis 1:2, which we looked at the other night, first line, Vaharetz, Hayata, Tahom, Bohu. Okay, should be ringing a bell. That is we'll come back to it, but it has a verb. The verb is in red. Okay, it doesn't mean Jesus spoke it, just in red. Then you got Vahashek, Al Panay, Tahom, and darkness was, but there's no verb to be. And darkness upon the face of the deep. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. Or darkness is upon the face of the deep. But you've got to put a verb to be in, even in Hebrew. Ruach Elohim, Marachafet, Al Panei Hamayim. And the wind of God, or the dirty big wind, is hovering on the face of the water. So we've got a verb, it's a participle, but it's a real verb. It's not just the verb to be. So the first one, there's your parsing out of the instant details. Okay. So we've actually got the verb to be there and it's a regular clause. Second one, haya is implied, but it's not explicit. So we'd have to say was. And the third one, we've got the participle, the PL participle, and because it's PL, it's not just shake, but it's kind of really hovering or hoovering up or doing something more active than just shake rather than just moving around. Okay, so different examples of clauses with or without a finite verb. Okay. Coming over to Greek, chapter 25 in Greek for the rest of us. So sentences can be simple, compound, or complex. And the point here is Greek loves complicated sentences, not just 2 bits, but lots of bits. And it's what's called a hypertactic language, whereas English and Hebrew are paratactic. So talking of syntax, Hebrew and English, you just want to put and put them next to each other, or more or less at the same level. Greek, you're going to have a main clause and then a whole series of dependent clauses, and actually quite a complex set of expressions being constructed in a very different way than we do in English. Okay, so particularly when you get away from narrative, like in Mark's Gospel, you get into Paul's letters, where his rhetoric is quite sophisticated rhetoric, then you've really got to unpack his sentences, which are like paragraphs. Okay, so that's what's going on there. Each clause and each phrase is still a thing in and of itself, but the way it works in Greek is to tend towards long and complicated sentences rather than lots of simple sentences. And he said, and he came, and he saw, and they listened, and they followed. Greek is not likely to do it that way.
So in 1 Peter, for example, verses, the first chapter of 1 Peter, verses 2, and I think it goes all the way to 17. You read that in English, you'll see it's broken up into sentences and paragraphs, but in fact it's not. 1 Peter 3 to 17 is one long sentence.
And presumably 1 Peter 1 and 2 is the greeting.
Yeah, it's just
greeting and address and so on.
That sort of thing. But 3 to, and usually it's they talk about 3 to 15, I think, but I think 16 and 17 can be included as well. It's something like 277 words. And it's just one long sentence, but you've got an idea, and then you've got this subordinate idea, and then another subordinate idea, and another one, and another one, and another one. And it just flows that way, but it makes it quite difficult to make sense of.
Yeah, good.
It's the longest sentence in the New Testament.
It's not bad for a fisherman.
And Jesus wept is the shortest.
Anacletus or Linus.
Mm-hmm. It is.
All right. So in Greek, the default word order is not quite it's still verb, subject, object, but there'll often be some sort of conjunction, except if the conjunction is de or un or whatever, then it's going to be pushed back to a second position anyway, hence the next bit. So by default, but not often found this way, it's still going to be verb, subject, object. But because it's such an inflected language, you can move the verb to the beginning. You can leave the verb at the beginning. You can bring the subject up to the beginning if you want to do it for rhetorical impact. And in Greek culture, we didn't even touch on this, but would have been relevant for biblical languages. There's a whole tradition of rhetoric, and people from the ruling classes and the retainer class being schooled in forms of effective oral communication, the art of rhetoric. And it's still today, if you go to Griffith University or UQ, you go into the law school, these brainy kids that end up in the faculty of law, they're actually having tutorials where they're practicing how to speak eloquently and to use effective forms of speech to get the judge or the jury on side. So they still teach law students the practice and the art of rhetoric because it's part of that profession, to be persuasive. Okay, we used to do it in colleges as well, but we gave up. So a phrase is probably going to it's going to be not going to have a verb, a finite verb, but it'll quite often be a phrase built around a preposition or a phrase built around a participle and the participle will often have a definite article in front of it. And so we're going to be looking at infinitives and participles in just a moment. So we'll come across these phrases quite a lot, okay? And we're also going to have relative clauses, and they're going to be the ones that we translate as whoever, anyone, who, various openings for phrases that involve a relative pronoun, or basically. And of course, many, many weeks ago, we looked very briefly at a number of word pairs that set up conditional two phrases, two clauses that talk to each other. Okay. So a little bit of a walk through the park, and I think over the last 6 weeks, really, we've been hammering the parse and translate thing, and encouraging you to kind of find the phrase, where's the verb, where's the preposition, find the phrase, and then make that the basis of your parsing. Well, it's there, you get it out of the parsing, and then make that the thing that controls your translating. Okay, so we've looked at a few different, I don't want to say aspect, that's the wrong word in this context, but we've looked at a number of different dimensions of verbs, including time and aspect, and last week, mood and voice, and today we want to look briefly at infinitives and participles. So the infinitive is that kind of version of the verb where nothing is bolted down other than the bare concept of the action itself. Okay, and in English, that's often expressed with the word to in front of the verb. To study, to drive, to eat, to imagine, to dream, and so on. Okay, so there are two forms. I'll just put the two forms up, and we're not going to remember this. We're not even going to try to remember it. But when the accordance software says, this is an infinitive construct or infinitive absolute, that's when we're going to go, aha, this is what we're dealing with here. Okay. The construct, as you'd probably imagine, it's to do with the construct chain. So it's a form of the infinitive, which is part of a choo-choo train. No, just a construct chain. Okay. When it's infinitive absolute, it means it's a standalone word. Okay, and so quite often in the parsing, you'll get noun, construct, noun, absolute. Same with participles. Absolute means it's a standalone word and is not in a construct relationship, whereas B'nai Yisrael, B'nai is construct, children of Israel. Okay. I think all we're hoping to kind of do tonight in terms of the infinitives is just to kind of put it on the radar. These are things that exist in our languages. They exist in English, whether we use them well or not, and we're certainly familiar with them. They will pop up in Hebrew. The accordance is going to point you to it. Rely on the software. Participles are that hybrid thing which is partly a verb and partly an adjective. So it's like a verbal adjective in a sense. Has aspects of the verb, and yet it has some elements that are more typical of nouns and of course of adjectives. So it's coming from the verb stem, but it's reflecting that basic action that verb is about, but it's more interested in the person or the thing that's doing the action. Okay. So when it's in the adjectival aspect, it's we're going to find they can be reflect gender, they can be singular or plural, and again they can be absolute, and they can be definite, and they can be in construct. They can also have a pronominal suffix on the end, so the E sound for my, the new sound for we, and so on. So we'll actually see a couple of them when we get into the tutorial exercises tonight. So, and just like any other adjective, participle can be in the same three typical adjectival roles. They can be an attribute of the main noun. They can be in a sort of, they can be the sort of predicate of the main idea, and they can be substantive, and where they're going to have, say, an article, and they're going to, if we talk about, we will do this to some extent in English. We will take a group of, we'll define a group of people with a participle, and then it sort of stands by itself as a substantive term rather than simply be an attribute or a predicate. Said because they do reflect gender and so on, we will find them in with the eam ending. So the basic form will be cocktail, you just using that verb which I was trained to use as my default paradigm, katal. So kotel is the masculine, kotelim is the masculine plural, kotelet or kotela or kotla is the feminine singular, and kotlot. So the bits that are in red are the perhaps by now vaguely familiar typical endings for masculine plural, feminine singular, feminine plural. Okay, those sort of sounds tend to go. But again, we'll be relying on the software to tell us what's going on. So with infinitives in the Greek, they occur a lot. And we'll have some more breakdown, but you can see from that first graph, there are 20 or so infinitives that occur fairly often, of which IME, that's the Greek word for an insurance company. No, that's the verb to be. It's the infinitive that occurs most often. Interesting, to be. In terms of tense, they're almost always, so more than 50% of the time, they're aorist. Okay, just an undefined, simple action. And almost, well, about 40% of the time, maybe they're actually present, which is a continuous kind of action. Hardly ever as perfect and future. And in terms of voice, 3/4 of the time in Greek, participles are active. And, well, much less time. There's only a much smaller percentage of middle and passive. And some of those middles would be, quote, deponent verbs that look middle, and they are middle, but actually they have a basically a active significance in English. So in real numbers, 2,291 times. The most common ones are IME, poieo, lego, ginomai, and erkomai. I was expecting the pistuo would occur more often in the Greek New Testament, but it only occurs 12 times as an infinitive. Okay, so maybe it's not such a big idea after all. It occurs in other ways, but I mean, I was surprised that I was looking for it, and I started looking down the list. It's way, way down the list when you do search results in accordance. Basically only occurs, which is said, in aorist and present. 76% of the time it's active and 20% middle, which means these are the ones you're going to see most often: luane and lucai. Okay, that ending, epsilon iota nun and sigma alpha iota, they're the most frequent forms of the infinitive in Greek. So you are going to run into those. I mean, if we were next week starting a class where we just read through Mark's Gospel or whatever. These are the forms we're going to run into with infinitives. With participles, same sort of thing. Yeah, there's masses of them. The one that shows up the most there is Lego. Again, overwhelmingly present, aorist, about a third, and then a significant but much smaller perfect tense. And again, much the same pattern, about 75% active and about 20% or so middle, some of which would be quote, quote, deponent, and the balance are passive. These are participles. So looking at it this way, 6,600 plus times Lego. So saying, okay. So these are the verbs that in English tend to have ing at the end. Saying, having, being, coming or going, and becoming. They're by far the most common participles in Greek, New Testament Greek. That's like 1,000 or so examples. And there's pistuo, because I had to go look, didn't I? 77 times. So believing, or the believing, which means the believers. Okay, so preposition, sorry, the participle with the article comes across in English as the believers. Okay, the ones believing, or the believing ones. Gets a bit, so again, we will find an aorist present and perfect most of the time, 2/3 of the time active, so on. Okay, so it's again, we're just going to be relying on the accordance to tell us participle, and then we're going to go, okay, participle, ing. Now, how do we narrow it down? How do we make it more specific? Is it plural, singular? Is it active or passive, and so on? The endings we won't be so familiar with because they're third declension endings. You think all the way back to about week 3 or 4, we talked about first declension nouns, second declension nouns, third declension nouns. So all of these participles decline in terms of masculine, feminine, neuter, and singular and plural, and in terms of nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, in both singular and plural. And those endings are third declension endings. You won't remember them. We're not trying to teach them. Just rely on the software. It'll be clear enough.
Are they the ones that aren't masculine or feminine endings, and the rest are all going box 3, isn't it? So if they haven't got that or the other, then it will be third declension.
Yeah. Box 3 are basically so first declension. Typically, it's called the A declension, and then largely feminine nouns, and so the stem ends with an alpha or an eta.
Yeah.
The second declension is the sort of, I got these back to front because
No, that's right.
second declension, the O declension, although we often teach that first. But yeah, just for a moment. What am I talking about here? Total nonsense. So the alpha declension, mostly feminine, not entirely. It's to do with the at sound. In the second declension, mostly masculine and neuter, and there's like 3 or 4 feminine O words. And then the third declension is everything else, and it's basically the stems that end with a consonant. And depending on what sort of consonant it is, whether it's a T or a D or a C or whatever, or a P, then what happens when you join the endings on? And so there are patterns, and we do recognize, we can recognize some of them. But again, our task is to be aware that there is such a thing as a third declension noun. So when it shows up in accordance, we're not totally freaked out Yeah, oh yeah, it's one of those. Yep, got it. Now, when you're sitting around the table at St. Paul's, it'll be a different ballgame. All right, you'll need to know the answer, or at least get to know the answer after a little while. So, in terms of a couple of other bits to wrap up with, one of the great advantages of Accordance, and it will be equally true of other Bible software packages, is you can get lots of commentaries in digital form. Of course, they cost money. So in the short term, it's probably a case of knowing you can use them upstairs. And the library copy of Accordance has all the major commentaries that are available. If it's available through Accordance, it's on the computer upstairs. If you find one that's missing, it just means it's become available and we hadn't noticed. And just remind Eve and she'll order it. It's that simple.
That's awesome.
Okay. So the commentaries range from high-end critical commentaries like Hermeneia, the Anchor Bible, which is a bit woofy in some ways, but the Anchor Bible commentary, and the Word Biblical Commentary, which I think is a really, really solid, good commentary series, down to much more devotional kind of commentaries. And I mean, Accordance has a wide range of theological perspectives and academic versus devotional commentary. So you pick the tools you need for the job you're doing. As you gradually build up a little bit of a set of digital tools, you'll find that you'll probably have most of the resources you need without having to go to the bookshelf or without having to come into the library and borrow stuff.
True.
But that means you probably spent way too much money on Accordance modules.
Yes.
Okay.
Quite true.
Oh, give me your password.
And then it's time for the pep talk about keeping it going. This was when we were going to say, so with all the Greek and Hebrew you now know, how are you going to keep it alive? Okay, so we've scaled that back with, so with a little bit of Greek and Hebrew, you're actually now on top of, how are we going to build on that? And how are we going to consolidate it and actually grow it? So there are some basic principles, and some of it goes back to the first week. We talked about learning styles. Each of us have our own ways of learning and doing stuff. But like any languages, and like playing a musical instrument, this is a skill. And if you don't use it, it'll disappear. So they're not just bits of information. So set some realistic goals. Don't try and be that student who just finished the course and then they spent half an hour every day reading the Hebrew Bible with the help of Accordance software, whatever. You're not going to keep that going for more than a week.
You're welcome to if you want to, but let's be realistic.
Yeah, Hebrew, Greek, whatever. I mean, that's not real. And we end up just feeling bad.
That's exactly real, Greg. That's exactly what I did.
I'm in the presence of greatness. There are the occasional really bizarre, deviant life forms that can do that, but most of us just muddle along. And the best way actually is to teach somebody else, of course, because then you've got to be looking at it and so on. Now you know why now you know why Chris is running a class at St. Paul's.
Keep it alive.
Keeps me focused.
Actually, vocab's important, but because we've got Accordance, it's not as important as once it would have been. There are ways of reading through, and there are suggestions for Bible reading plans based on Greek and Hebrew and so on. Guess what? There's a lot more of them in Greek, biblical Greek, than biblical Hebrew. And they recommend starting with something like 1 John because the Greek is easier and so on. But actually, most of us, by this point in this subject, are getting pretty comfortable with using Accordance. We're able to navigate a paragraph of Hebrew or Greek, and hopefully we're able to identify phrases and clauses and begin to think about how we might express that. But we're just not up to the idea of sitting down with a Hebrew Bible and starting to read. Will be cool for the first 2 verses, of Genesis, but verse 3 will come after verse 2, and verse 4 will come after that, and so on. So that's not really going to work. So let's skip all these things that I was going to talk about earlier in the course. So the first is, it's easier to find resources online for Greek than for Hebrew. Interestingly, this is actually a resource which is part of Accordance, and it's designed to be an adult beginner's pathway to biblical Hebrew. It's 20 years old or so by now, 30 years old by now, but it's all integrated into your text, so it's going to work in terms of reading the text and all that sort of stuff. It's $80 US, and yes, you can get a 25% discount, but it's still going to be close to double that in Australian dollars, basically. There certainly are online, so there are virtually no, of course you can just go and enroll for New Testament Greek 1 next semester, or Hebrew 1 next semester. There are 3 colleges in the University of Divinity that are offering New Testament Greek 1, including an online class. And there's 1 place offering Hebrew 1 online. So it's just not as much investment in teaching and learning Hebrew as there is Greek within the Christian theological colleges. There are lots of rather wacko, Hebrew for Christians kind of courses online that will certainly teach you the Hebrew, but they'll give you some pretty weird ideas. They'll be pushing some strange interpretations as you go along. So depending what level of Hebrew you want to kind of connect with, something like this might be a possibility, or the beginner's book on biblical Hebrew, which we haven't used as a textbook. It's one that I know Zoe has used, and maybe we'll put those details up on the forum before the end of the week as well. But that was just one that I came across, and there are several Hebrew textbooks through Accordance, but that's one that I thought looked quite interesting, looked like it might be worth using. The other thing, which I was really surprised and delighted to find, is that Moreland College, which is what used to be the Baptist Theological College, New South Wales, they teach New Testament Greek 1 online, self-paced resources free of charge. I have pointed this out to Ruth and said, we could do this. The deal is you sign up, you register, you get access to their Moodle site. They've produced all these resources for their regular class, but it's totally free. You work at your own pace. And when you think you're ready to sit the exam, you pay a fee to sit the exam. And if you pass the exam, you get recognition of prior learning to go on with Greek 2. So if you're just looking for a way to actually learn New Testament Greek, then this might well be worth exploring. Okay, it's Australian. I did a bit of a poke around. I'm pretty sure they're using Duff elements.
Just say there, the textbook, Jeremy Duff element.
Yeah, I saw I've seen it there somewhere. So that's certainly an option that is available for people. I couldn't find anything like that for Hebrew. It doesn't mean it's not there. I just haven't found it yet, and Zoe hasn't found it yet either. We have been looking and poking around. Of course, there are also, just as there are Hebrew grammars and learning biblical Hebrew modules in Accordance, there are also Greek grammars. So you can get Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek in Accordance. And a whole lot of his other tools are part of the Accordance modules. And he also has his own online, learn Greek with me kind of thing, where basically I don't think there's a live person actually instructing anymore, but it's a whole set of resources with sort of videos and other digital resources where you can work your way through Basics of Biblical Greek chapter by chapter, and all the audio and the video and everything else is there to support you for a fee. It's it costs a reasonable amount of money to do that. Of the options that are around for New Testament Greek, I'm inclined to think the Morling College one is pretty good as an option. There's also the option of turning up at St. Paul's for the Greek reading and learning class. I'm going to hand over to Chris just to say something brief and inspiring as to why we all should sign up.
What's a sausage roll?
Yes. So for a few years now, I've been teaching New Testament Greek to folk at St. Paul's, and I've had one lady in particular who's gone on for the last probably about 4 or 5 years now, and she's in her 70s and is really quite an inspiring sort of lady in her own right. She's really dedicated. I've had others who've joined and sort of dropped out, and that's just par for the course, really. But we'll start again next year. I think for those who have.
Sorry, Chris, it's just. Well, it was coming up.
Oh, that's all right. For those who've done this course, it will change the way that we sort of approach Greek next year. And I think we'll start to use a bit more Accordance. We'll use some of the stuff that we can get from Accordance, maybe workbook. But we'll perhaps be a little bit more inductive. Next year, we'll work through the Gospel of Mark. So we'll probably over the year we'll translate most, if not all, of the Gospel of Mark, depending on how quick we can be. But you'll come across all the forms of nouns and verbs, and so there's a fair amount of rote learning in learning New Testament Greek. If you want to learn New Testament Greek properly, then that's just the way it is. But I think sort of we'll try and get into the text to get some appreciation for how Greek works right from the get-go, because I think that's actually a really satisfying way of learning. So we haven't yet decided what day, so I'll have to let you know, but how that's going to fit into the week, but that's as much down to the students as anything else. But already we've got Finn and Keith and Paul Timberlake is joining us. So the core of us from this class anyway. So if you're around and you'd like to join, then feel free. And I'll certainly post details as soon as we've got them.
Okay, thank you. And how much do you charge?
Well, like Morling College, it's all free. One other I mean, that raises an interesting point, though. Morling College will give you an exam for a fee that gives you recognition of prior learning. That's something that I think we need to explore with regard to learning Greek. I mean, because I really started doing it as much as Greg said, the best way to keep up your language skills is to teach it. And that's largely why I started teaching it, because it was really good for me as well as helping other folk. But it has become a bit of an issue in terms of, well, all right, you learn Greek with me, and if you've learned it well enough that you can read it, what does that mean in terms of a degree course, or and how do I get credit for the fact that I can actually read this stuff and don't have to sit through an entire subject redoing stuff that I've already done? So that's a conversation that I think we need to have.
Yeah, it'd be good to find out what kind of stuff is covered by the more. I mean, it's going to be the stuff that you covered once you've got to chapter 22 of duff,
Yeah.
basically.
So if it's like ACU, they cover 1 to 10 in the first semester, chapters 1 to 10 of Duff. And I assume that maybe Morling's doing something similar. So Duff's got about 20 chapters in him.
Okay.
So they cover about half of Duff in the first semester and then the second half in the second semester.
Yeah, it would be worth checking. There must be a logical before you get into subjunctives and
Yeah.
I won't get and omega, me verbs and so on. Yeah, there's a point where it gets kind of a bit weird. All right, so that's well worth exploring, and even the idea that sort of encouraging and supporting people to prepare for the Morling exam if they want to get credit. Yeah. And I'm presuming Zoe's not feeling tempted to develop a self-paced online Hebrew course just yet.
Look, Greg, I yearn for the day when I can afford to do ministry for free, basically.
Oh. Yes, well,
I'm looking. That's my retirement plan: is to be able to minister without needing to be paid.
I hope you soon become so wealthy you don't need money. That'd be good. So we're about to break.
Are you and I in the same diocese?
Sort of, although I'm mostly in Grafton. Okay, so thinking ahead. So sometime later tonight, the week 12 quiz becomes available, and it's 20%. It's an hour as the standard amount of time for that. Again, it's an open book exam. As much as possible, except for the matching type exercises, every other question will allow you to prepare your answer in Word and upload it as a document, but it has to be a separate document for each question. You can't have all three answers in the one document loaded up. It's a separate one-page document, whatever. For each.
Might be good for the translation then with the tools we've been using in Word,
Yeah.
and then we can just go boop. Right.
Yeah. Now, whether you really got the time to do one of those pages, and I don't know, but
What in Word?
yeah, in terms of the amount of time you got in an hour to do.
Oh, I've got it down pat to about 30 seconds into a.
You don't know which passage it is.
No, but whatever it is, you type it and
Right.
you take it straight into a thing. It takes me 30 seconds.
Copy, select all, copy, paste. Okay, cool. That'll be fun.
Ask him.
Next week, next Monday, it's not quite finished. Next Monday is the last of the tutorials, and that'll be Greek with Chris next Monday at 4. And then on the 16th of November, we have our week 14 final assessment item, a 2-hour task, and worth 40% of the marks, and same kind of design as week 12, except that it's covering, in theory, it's covering everything you've looked at and learned or heard about from week 1 to 12. Okay. So it's like both the week 6 and the week 12 exam being put together, but it ain't that simple. We didn't just rerun the week 6 and the week 12 exam and call it week 14. Okay, but it is going to ask questions about stuff we did right back in week 1, as well as stuff we're asking you to do, stuff that we've been talking about tonight.
So just a question. I'm just finding an email from you from a few weeks ago. It just says that the week 12 quiz is just focusing on week 6 to 11, so nothing tonight.
Correct.
Thank God.
We didn't cover anything tonight, did we?
Nothing.
Well, we did focus and
I
courses.
thought that email said 6 to 10.
That's
That's wishful thinking for this.
the 6 to 10 is the words.
Yes.
The
vocab.
vocab. Yeah. There's a
Oh,
couple
I
of
think
emails.
it said 6 to 10 on all of them. But 6 to 10 is just the words, is it?
In the unit outline for the quiz in week 12, says it covers material from week 6 to 11. Okay, not week 6 to 10. That's what's in the unit profile.